Born on September 15, 1830, in a small town of Oaxaca, Mexico, a young boy named Porfirio Diaz, determined to change Mexico, would eventually rise to the highest position in the government. As a ruler, Diaz had the thought of Mexico constantly in his mind, how to fix the economy, how to lower the crime, but he lost many of his revolutionary ideals in the process. Porfirio Diaz started out as a revolutionary in the 1857 War of Reforms. He fought against the rule of the Austrian Emperor Maximilian, who had resigned as the monarch of Austria and taken control over Mexico from President Benito Juarez with the support of the French. Throughout the war, Diaz was promoted steadily with each victory and became the divisional general for the Revolutionary Army in 1863. The revolutionaries eventually defeated Maximilian's army with the ingenious tactics of General Diaz. Afterwards, Diaz denounced his retirement as divisional general and worked on the sidelines until 1876, when the president at that time was Lerdo de Tejada. Lerdo had brought disaster to Mexico, and Diaz had felt that it was only right to rid the country of such a ruler. Diaz ruled from 1876 to 1911, with only one gap in between, when he let one of his trustworthy companions, Manuel Gonzalez, win the elections and rule from 1880 to 1884.
Under President Diaz, Mexico's economy flourished. The production of petroleum rose from 10,000 barrels in 1901 to 12.5 million in 1911. However, this amount of progress only occurred because of many investments from foreign countries, like the U.S. Diaz once said about his country, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." Diaz also lowered the foreign debt to the U.S. and European countries accumulated by past rulers. As Mexico's economy grew, many citizens saw this as a chance to get a job. Foreigners flocked to Mexico and were treated even better than Mexicans under Diaz's regime. In any court case of a Mexican versus a foreigner, the foreigner always won unless Diaz said otherwise. Movie producers saw Mexico as a beautiful area and rushed to Mexico to film. From these people, Diaz collected money for filming on Mexican soil. With the money, he increased the 567 kilometers of railway in 1876 to 16,285 kilometers in 1906. He also improved the telegraph system and increased them from 10,000 kilometers to 110,000 kilometers in 1906.
President Diaz's politics, however, were not as admirable. As president, he passed legislative reforms that allowed him to stay in office for nearly 32 years. As a result of these reforms, all of the political power in Mexico became concentrated in the executive branch, as opposed to being distributed evenly among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. His policies resulted in an effective centralized government and his role as a dictator. Diaz threw staged elections but claimed that he preserved the Republican and Democratic form of government. Also, in a 1908 interview with James Creelman of Pearson's magazine, Diaz said, "I have waited patiently for the day when the people of the Mexican Republic would be prepared to choose and change their government at every election without danger of armed revolutions, and without injury to the national credit or interference with national progress. I believe that day has come." Diaz never stepped down until 1911 when he fled to Europe. He also appointed governors to rule different parts of Mexico. Many of them were big businessmen.
Many social problems were also created from Diaz's policies about the economy and politics of Mexico. The foreign investments, although they helped Mexico as a whole, caused small businesses and individual workers to suffer. Under Diaz, lower working-class citizens suffered from poor working conditions, inflation, inferior housing, low wages, and deficient social services. All the social classes, including the upper class, disapproved of Mexico's reliance on foreign investments, but their cries for change fell on deaf ears. In Mexico, there was no free speech. Diaz had a policy called pan, palo, le fuego. If Mexicans spoke against the president, he would first resort to bribery, pan, then blackmail, palo, and finally killed him with the excuse "shot while attempting to escape," le fuga. In this way, many social outbursts were quelled. The public never knew about this policy because Diaz controlled the media. The book The Maker of Modern Mexico by Ethel Tweedy was even approved by Diaz through a letter. Mexico, November 23, 1904.
Dear Mrs. Tweedy, as the book you published entitled Mexico as I Saw It is not only proof of the veracity which has distinguished your publications, but also a good guarantee that the same conditions will exist in the forthcoming description of the people, places, and races with which your next book will deal. I have no hesitation in placing in your hands documentary facts demonstrating the progress of this country, and also those which appertain to myself, which may be made public through the medium of your intelligent and facile pen. With my most sincere thanks for the devotion you have shown in this undertaking, I remain your most sincere, Porfirio Diaz.
All of the money that came into Mexico also went to Diaz, his advisors, and the governors that he appointed. In this way, Mexicans were impoverished, while their country became a larger part of the global economy. Diaz also created a police force called the Rurales. The Rurales were bandits and criminals that were promised amnesty if they worked on the police force for a pay that was higher than any cavalryman in the world. Few could resist this offer, and because of this, crime became virtually non-existent in Mexico. The Rurales, however, were not always principled, and still beat any supposed criminals they found, mercilessly whether they were guilty or innocent.
Although Diaz had good intentions for Mexico, he turned his own people against himself due to his obsession with power. His last run for office was in the 1910 elections against Francisco Madero. By this time, the Mexicans were tired of Diaz, and Madero's loss showed just how bluntly Diaz was throwing the election. That same year, the Mexican Revolution started and Diaz was kicked out of the presidency. To this day, Porfirio Diaz remains a controversial figure. Some still view him as a respectful figure in Mexican history, while others see him as a dictator who oppressed his people for personal gains. Either way, whether Diaz is viewed as a revolutionary or caudillo, he was still an influential figure in Mexican history.